My definitive fake tagline for this film is "Someone is staring at you in personal growth," and I will explain later why.
Welcome to In Front of Ira.
We're two historians.
And friends.
And lovers.
Of romantic comedies.
And this is the podcast in which we answer the age-old question.
Will they or won't they?
Is it or isn't it a romantic comedy?
Indeed.
And now we sing the theme song we don't have.
Theme song, theme song, theme song.
You say
theme
potato,
song.
I say potato.
I say potato, you say theme song. This is going to go well. So today is our first episode, and for our first episode, we picked what we think is the most definite romantic comedy of them all. It is 1989's Rob Reiner directed, Nora Ephron written, starring Meg Ryan and Billy Crystal, among other wonderful actors, When Harry Met Sally. The way that this podcast works is that we watch a movie, we research that movie, and then we talk about that movie. But in order to do that, we need some guidance. And for that, we have some categories. And the first category that we always like to start these things off with is taglines. Every movie has one or more taglines. So we're going to look at the actual taglines of the movies that we're going to watch. And then we'll come up with some fake taglines that explain to us better what the movie is actually about. So, Sabrina, you researched the tagline or taglines for this, our first episode for When Harry Met Sally. What are the taglines for that movie? I'm actually quite interested to know, because it seems there are some obvious ones.
They're very, very obvious. There are two of them. The one is, can two friends sleep together and still love each other in the morning? And the second one is, can men and women be friends, or does sex always get in the way? Which feels like the pitch to the studio rather than the tagline.
They just left that in. They were like, this is, sold, green light. Just keep it as a tagline. We don't want to deal with this anymore. So what is your fake tagline? What is the thing that you came up with that this movie is actually about?
Well, I have a selection. My first one is, I roll down the window.
We'll get to that.
White man's overbite. Also up there. Do you have a good one? I don't have a good one, actually. I think that
my tagline for this movie is, Jess and Marie have annoying friends.
That's very true. Conversations in restaurants is my tagline, I think.
That's basically if it was a 90s indie movie.
Yeah.
Like, that's what this would be called. It's kind of a brilliant movie, which is why we're starting our romantic comedy podcast with this movie. And it's a movie that isn't very movie-y in the sense that there's no big set pieces, no action, which is what Rob Reiner actually said in preparing this movie. There is a wonderful introduction that Nora Ephron writes for the publication of the screenplay. That's basically just a televangelist.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna read to you the way that Rob Reiner phrased this to Nora Ephron, and it goes like this. Notes that Nora Ephron says from February 5th, 1985, when they were discussing this movie. This is a talk piece. There are no chase scenes, no food fights. This is walks, apartments, phones, restaurants, movies.
Yeah, and I think he says the same thing in the audio commentary for the film. That it's no there's no obstacles. It's mostly just people having conversations. It's wall-to-wall dialogue. You cut from people in one restaurant or in central to people in Central Park talking, to people talking in their apartments, to people talking on the phone, to be like, there isn't anything else. And I think that the interesting bit is that Nora Ephron describes this as there's two traditions of romantic comedies. One of them is the Jewish tradition, the other one is the Christian tradition. And the Jewish tradition of romantic comedies is that there's the conflict is internal. So there's no obstacle. The whole conflict is internal. Mostly the neurosis of the male lead rather than anything else. And the Christian tradition is just outside obstacles that you have to overcome. So, and I thought that was interesting because that's basically it.
There's really nothing external. Like nobody's
No.
keeping them apart.
No, the only thing that's keeping them apart is that they need to, I guess, grow up and get to know themselves more than anything, especially him, but her too, in so many ways.
Yeah. So should we just kind of dive into the movie, describe what happens in the movie for the three people who clicked on a romantic comedy themed podcast called In Front of Ira and don't know what this movie is?
Don't know why it's called In Front of Ira. Yeah, what is it? I mean, I think the tagline is misleading in that I think that's what everyone thinks the movie is about. Everyone thinks the movie is about can men and women be friends? But then everyone who made the movie says it's not about that at all. It's about how men and women are in relationships and, their differences. And obviously we can talk about whether that's aged well or not, I guess. But it's still interesting that what everyone thinks the movie is about is not really that. And I think that's also why a lot of people criticize it now, even though that's not actually the film. And most people who seem to criticize it have never seen it or have seen bits and bobs of it and not the whole film.
Right. So can women and men be friends, or can people just be in relationships, and how are they different? So the movie opens with and again, I'm just looking at the screenplay here. I looked at the screenplay again in preparation for this, and it has some really telling, interesting description and dialogue. So the way that Nora Ephron chooses to open this movie, and she says that it's basically a collaboration. She writes a first draft, then they keep working on it, but still, like, this has her name on it. So let's give Nora some credit. And it starts with an old couple talking about how they met. This is a famous scene where the man says, I was sitting with my friend Arthur Kornblum in a restaurant. There was a Horn and Hart at a cafeteria, and this beautiful girl walked in, and it points to the woman sitting next to him. And then we fade out from this almost like documentary style opening. Like you feel like you're not watching a romantic comedy movie. You definitely don't feel like you're watching something like Notting Hill or The Proposal. Like those would be incongruous if that started. You feel like you're watching something else. You're watching something nostalgic. I think that's what that hammers home. And then we fade into external University of Chicago campus day, and we get a card that it is the University of Chicago, and we're in 1977. So this movie comes out in 1989, 1990, depending. And so we're like 13 years-ish before this is supposed to be set. And we meet Harry Burns, who is described as 26 years old, just graduated from law school, wearing jeans and a sweatshirt, which is not the most descriptive that you can get. But I guess if you've cast Billy Crystal, then A, nobody's going to buy that he actually is 26, and B, nobody actually cares. Yeah. So he's kissing Amanda. She has long, straight hair that she irons, is how she's described. That's her character. That's her whole character.
To be fair, that's also everything we see of her. She has long, straight hair that she irons. Yeah.
And then they say, I love you. And then somebody drives up, Sally Albright, who is described as 21 years old. She's very pretty, although not necessarily in an obvious way, which feels like a very screenplay way of describing a character that you don't really want to describe because you know it's going to be played by a beautiful Hollywood actress anyway. It just it feels like it needs to be there. But so what's interesting to me here is that we don't really get a whole lot of description of Harry. We get that he's 26 and he just graduated from law school, and Sally is 5 years younger. And now they're going to drive together from Chicago to New York. It's an 18-hour drive, and they supposedly will get to know each other pretty well on the way to New York, where they're both about to start new lives. So this is the first part of the movie, and let's talk about that first part of the movie because it has some pretty amazing scenes.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that always struck me about it is that it's so immediately funny. Like they're both in the car, and you immediately get to know them, and you know how they're set up. And I guess like it's not the most obvious meet cute of them all. Like they're stuck in this car together for however many hours. Chicago to New York should be a good long while. And we immediately learn that she's like has this plan for who's gonna drive when, and it's all set out and where they're gonna stop, and she's like super organized. And also when we see her, she immediately rolls her eyes at him and Amanda's interaction. But as soon as he's in the car, they somehow have this immediately very serious discussion about life and death. And also he spits the grapes at the window, and then it says the immortal line, I'll roll down the window after he spits the grapes against the window. And I think, yeah, it doesn't, I don't think it takes longer than a minute after they're in the car that they're on to the subject of the fact that he thinks about death a lot, and that makes him very deep. Like, I mean, that's like his whole character at that point, which makes sense because he's like a 20-something college graduate, like
A lawyer who has to have something that about him that is not him being a lawyer, I think is the idea.
Yeah, I mean, later he's a political consultant. I don't know if you're like, does he have a law degree? Is that what we know?
He has a law degree. That's what
okay.
That's what it says at the beginning. But we don't actually know that from the movie. We know that from the screenplay because that describes it. He's obviously not a lawyer to become a lawyer. He doesn't get a law degree to become a lawyer. He gets it to do something important in the world because he's a deep person. Yeah. So what I really like about this, and I mean we've both seen this movie like 13,000 times each. The way that they, as you said, kind of throw them right into this situation where they have to deal with each other even though they might not want to, and you see these differences in the characters. And the famous Harry spitting grape seeds against the window before he realizes that the window isn't rolled down, and then saying, I'll roll down the window as Sally kind of chastises him for it, is just such a wonderful encapsulation of a certain kind of character, of somebody who does things before really thinking about what the consequences are. And at the same time fashions himself a deep thinker who is really, really happy that he presents this, what he calls a dark side, which is also a weird thing. Like, I don't think you generally approach people that you meet and then are stuck in a small space with, and then you talk about your dark side. I feel like that's a little bit creepy, but that's just how he comes right out of the gate.
I mean, I've been to enough parties in my university years to tell you that a lot of men think it's a great conversation opener to tell you that they have a dark side and that they listen to very deep things like Morrissey, The Smiths, and like their favorite film is Pulp Fiction. So I think it's very authentic to where he is in his life. To be fair,
you have met Harry Burns, is what you're saying.
Like, yeah. I mean, I think if I've met actual Harry Burns, I probably would have preferred that over some of the guys I've met. But yeah, I've met the type, I guess. And yeah.
I mean, the script here says after his whole dark side thing, suppose nothing happens to you, suppose you live there your whole life and nothing happens, you've never meet anyone, you never become anything, and finally you die one of those New York deaths where nobody notices for 2 weeks until the smell drifts out in the hallway. And the stage direction right after that says, Sally looks over at Harry. Who am I stuck in a car with? She looks back at the road. So
Yeah.
she's very resigned. She's the person being talked at the party, essentially.
Yeah, obviously. And I think and then they get to Casablanca at some point, which obviously is also a through line, I think, of the whole thing. And that discussion about whether or not she would stay with Humphrey Bogart, or, what the most sensible decision would have been.
Yeah. Which both points out character beats, and it references that Casablanca is going to be a thing between them. And also it immediately puts you in that romantic, old school Hollywood mode, because this is such a well-known romance, and this whole nostalgic thing comes back again.
Yeah, and I think the interesting thing is that Casablanca is obviously very much the classic thing of like there are tons of outside obstacles why they are not together, whereas the average Joe or the average Harry, I guess, is not usually confronted with these big obstacles. It's mostly really about like figuring out again, like figuring out who you are and getting over your own neurosis to get to the point where you can actually be in a relationship. And that's probably the biggest obstacle of them all, and will always be the biggest obstacle of them all. And the 26-year-old guy with the law degree who is very fond of his dark side is probably not in that place yet. And to be fair, neither is she. Like, she still thinks it's important to make sensible decisions. And I don't know, sprays hairspray on herself in the crowded car, but I guess that's the 80s, or in that case, like, we're still in the late 70s where nobody thought about that.
Nobody cared about the ozone layer. Yeah. So what I think about actually, like, in terms of the internal and external conflict, not to make this the Casablanca podcast now, but isn't internal conflict about Humphrey Bogart being able to be in a relationship in the end what clinches it as well? Because he sends Ingrid Bergman away in order to start a relationship with Captain Renault. Isn't that how that movie works?
I mean, if when Harry Met Sally had ended that way, I guess it would have been Harry hitting it off with Bruno Kirby. I don't know, or Rob Reiner. It turns completely meta, and Rob Reiner walks onto the screen and then off into the sunset with Billy Crystal. But yeah.
So they drive to New York, and this is basically a set piece for giving us a whole bunch of scenes. It's kind of a wonderful, both an 80s trope and not, because it's kind of a montage that's not a montage. Like, you get the training montage of them getting to know each other by showing them in restaurants and walking and to and fro, and the diner where the first time they talk about their relationship hang-ups, and they talk about her specific way of ordering food, so kind of introducing us to these characters and how they're basically nothing alike. I think this is really the point of this whole like drive to New York. These two characters are stuck together, and they're nothing alike.
Yeah, and I mean that's also obviously one of the classic tropes. There's so many tropes you can assign to them. You could be like the grumpy one and the sunshine one, even though that like kind of changes a bit as the film goes on, as she also gets disillusioned by her breakup and life. And they're not exactly enemies, two friends, two lovers, but they definitely don't like each other, and I think that's an important bit. And there's also where, like, again, there's no outside obstacle, but what also is incredibly important for any kind of development is that there is like a long passage of time. Like, everything is so much more believable that they eventually do like each other. because we jump in time so much. And like it's entirely realistic that someone who like doesn't click in their early mid 20s, especially because there is also an age difference between them. It's not quite as big as Billy Crystal and McRyan were, but it's still there. And I think that like that makes sense that then if they connect later in their 30s, that they have much more in common, because that age difference doesn't matter anymore that much. I think that's also important. And they have hit several like moments in their lives that they bond over, which is their, divorce, and also kind of divorce, like it's a long-term relationship that has ended even though it wasn't a marriage. So I think that the passage of time is actually like the biggest factor, that makes that believable and realistic in so many ways.
So I think this is going to become, I'm already predicting this is going to become a thing when we discuss romantic comedies, because I've noticed this about a lot of the best of them. And we have talked off camera, off microphone about this, that they do require a certain passage of time.
Yeah.
You need to spend time with these people in order to understand why they should or shouldn't be together. And the almost best way to do that is to show actual passage of time on screen. And when Harry Met Sally does this, by doing this long montage over these 18 hours that they're first together, and then jumping in time, and then them reacquainting each other, all of that. So it's really a movie that's focused on time. Time is, in essence, the enemy, if you want, because then if you think about what you said with the Jewish tradition of the romantic comedy, where all the conflict is internal, right up to the last moment of that romantic comedy, that makes perfect sense. That is how it's framed and how it's constructed.
Yeah, and I mean the fact that I think actually when you think about it, the way he sets it up is he thinks about death all the time. And I think when he thinks about death in his 20s, he's actually standing in his way, because that's the thing, right? When you're in your 20s, you're always like, oh, in many ways you're like, oh, I have so much time left, and you don't know what to do with it. And it's that constant thing of like, oh, I'm so deep, I think about death, but you don't actually know what any of that means yet. And then you get to your 30s and you realize that things do end, like relationships do end, and maybe, people die, obviously, actually. And at some point, the fact that time runs out is actually starting to work in your favor, because you do realize that, yes, actually all we do have is time, so maybe we shouldn't waste it, which is also why by the end, when he has this final realization, he goes to her, and when you realize you want to spend the rest of your life with someone, you want the rest of your life to start now. You just need to get to that point, because I think before it's always the dilly-dallying of like, what am I going to do with all this time? I don't want to waste my time, and you don't actually know what that means at all. And I think that's also probably what makes this a timeless story in so many ways, because that's just, like how everyone grows up, I guess. And yeah, and there's also where there isn't that big obstacle at the end. There isn't anything big that happens. The only thing he does is it's New Year's Eve, and he's like, oh God, actually, what am I doing? And then starts running, and then talks to her, and that solves everything. Like, that's literally it. There isn't an airport chase scene either. Like, there isn't anything.
Yeah.
He has to stop her from doing, like flying away, starting a new job, getting married, all of these things.
And the thing that really struck me, and I remember watching this for the first time, which is a long time ago, probably on a VHS tape at some point on a small CRT television, and coming to the point at the end of the movie where, spoiler alert, go watch the movie if you're listening to this and you haven't watched the movie, then we can't help you, and probably you should. Where he starts running on New Year's Eve, which again, like, is kind of just a symbol for time. Like, New Year's Eve is the symbol for time changing over, but he doesn't have any external, oh, this is it. It's just kind of this realization that time is passing. And for me, it was a weird ending, because there wasn't this external conflict. There wasn't there was no literal ticking clock. There was just a ticking clock that was ticking off into eternity. It's a strange ending to a movie, if you really think about it. And I've seen it so many times now that it flows naturally. But the first time you see it, it's, wait, this is it? there's nothing happening that makes him realize that, which is kind of the brilliance of this movie, because it doesn't need any external points that really kick things off. That doesn't mean that there aren't plot points, there aren't external things happening to our characters, but it doesn't need the big set piece.
Yeah. And I mean, that's the interesting bit too, that they went back and forth so much on how this should actually end. Like, that's the one thing they weren't set on. And there's different endings that they thought about that I think they also actually filmed, because they did go back and reshot that ending at some point. So they didn't have that. And like, one of the versions they had was just the fact they didn't get together. Then there was apparently a version where they jumped further in time again, and then had them get back together. But they ended up settling on this after, I guess, thinking about it and going back and forth on it, and sort of trying to figure out that they had to get them back together, because that's also the sort of the expected ending, but it also made sense in a kind of way. And I think, yeah, and I think that's that other thing about like passage of time, and I think one of the reviews I read also does this, but it also chimes with me. So I actually didn't see this film for a long time. The first time I watched it, I think, is less than 10 years ago. And so I'm 33, so I think I watched it in like my mid 20s, and I didn't get it. Like, I enjoyed it, but I didn't get it, and I didn't get the ending. And like, the older I got, the more I get it, because now I get it. Like, now that ending makes complete sense to me. And that's the thing. Like, I also, like, I think that's, you need to get to a certain age to understand what's happening, because we all will be 40 someday, I guess. So, yeah, it makes sense. But I do also like that it's not about like the clock that's ticking. It's not like, oh, the biological clock or anything. Like, of course, she does struggle with that, and the women in the movie have, I think, more societal pressure that you also do see, that they're, that whole, like, especially when they're in the cafe, and like Carrie Fisher and I'm forgetting the other actress's name that's there with them, because their part is smaller, but the three of them, when they're sitting in Central Park, I think at Tavern on the Green, and with Carrie Fisher's Rolodex, where she's like, "Oh, married, folds over corner," like that's the most relatable thing when you're 33 years old. Then you're like, okay, well, he's married now, but like, let's give it some time, because that will change everything, and that's the truth, right? And that's also what happens to Harry. So, anyway, where was it going with this? Yeah, I think it makes sense that it's not about a biological clock. Actually, all of them remain childless, as far as we know. Like Bruno Kirby and Carrie Fisher also. I mean, I don't know what age the actors were, but like, I mean, everyone would have been in an age where you would expect people to like have children, and none of them do. And I think that's also interesting, actually, to see that doesn't really factor in. I think there is that biological clock thing going on somewhere in the background, but it's not like a plot point. It's not like, oh my god, I have to procreate. So, which actually is fairly refreshing, I think, for 89, because yeah, that wasn't always the case.
So I think what I'm going to do, I'm going to push ahead and just kind of like try to chronologically connect this movie. So we arrive with them in New York, and they basically say goodbye. And this could be it, right? This could be the short film version where two people somehow touched something off in each other by meeting somebody who was completely unlike them, and then it defines them in some way, and here we depart. But in this movie, we depart, and it doesn't really seem to trigger anything in any of them. They kind of almost forget about each other, even though Harry very much like basically came on to her, and she was very annoyed by him for 18 hours and probably won't forget that very, very quickly. But then they meet again at LaGuardia Airport, and we get a card that it's 5 years later. So we're in 1982 now, and everybody looks very 1982, which I think is also one of the strengths of this movie and of this idea of the passage of time, that you really get it through the styles. We didn't really talk so much about the 1970s styles that they put Billy Crystal and Meg Ryan in. but it's pretty uncanny. And then in 1982, everybody's in power suits and ties, and when they're in their off time, in like fancy sneakers. So they meet again in LaGuardia Airport, and now Sally is the age that Harry was the first time that they met, which I think is probably on purpose, that they kind of like did this 5 year skip thing there. And now she's kissing who is described as a very attractive man, although it's not that easy to see him at the moment. His name is Joe, played by, and this is one of the this movie keeps on giving aspects of it all, played by the son of former President Gerald R. Ford at this point, which is why he looks like former President
I
Gerald
was going
R.
to say,
Ford.
once you have that information, you cannot unsee that he looks like Gerald Ford. It's pretty funny.
And so, like, this is kind of flipping the situation that you have, because you start off with Amanda and Harry kissing and Sari barging in, and now it's him kind of barging in on them kissing, and kind of meeting her again and being awkward about it, but kind of something stuck. So what we're planting here is the seed that 5 years ago, maybe it wasn't the most memorable experience in either life, but something stuck because he recognizes her.
Yeah. And
but he only recognized her, and this is the funny part, after he doesn't recognize her and actually recognizes Joe, who he also knows. So this is kind of like the funny piece, because like he approaches and you kind of think that, oh yeah, he knows that this is Sally, and he doesn't. He recognizes Joe, and then she recognizes him, and then they're on an airplane together, and then kind of the mutual recognition comes, where Harry realizes that this is the person he drove to New York with, and she's already ahead of him, and she's kind of very very precious about him. Like, I'm so much more in tune. I'm so much smarter that I knew this before. That I recognized this guy who I actually didn't want to recognize him.
Yeah, and I think so. We're meeting Gerald Ford's son, which and I think the other interesting bit is when they do recognize each other again is only because of how she orders her food on the airplane, or rather her drink, her Bloody Mary on the plane. Because obviously that's her quirk of like ordering everything on the side and very specific in a specific way. And I think one of my favorite pieces of trivia is that that's just how Nora Ephron ordered her food, and Rob Reiner was like, oh my god, that has to go in the movie, like that's so insane. And she was like, she didn't even realize that was weird, and that's not how everyone did it, or how that was anything out of the ordinary or potentially annoying for like wait staff. Like I think that is also just funny, but that's also what I love about the scene. And then when he switches seats with the other guy on the plane to sit next to her, and they have their whole exchange there. And
the whole scene is Sally saying, after asking the stewardess, which is how the character is credited here, very 1980s, do you have any Bloody Mary mix? And she says yes. And as she starts to pour, Sally says, no, wait, here's what I want. Regular tomato juice, filled about 3/4, and add a splash of Bloody Mary mix. Just a splash. And then Harry's head starts to rise again. A little piece of lime, but on the side. And after on the side, he says the University of Chicago, right? So he recognizes on the side. On the side, also great tagline for this movie, which I don't know what that means, but it just would be. Or just great name for a romantic comedy.
Carrie Fisher is on the side of the guy she keeps dating is married, I know, you're right. I know you're right. And also I have to interject this, you can edit it somewhere else, but the thing is, I think, and this is actually where we jump to after that bit, I think, because I think actually the best, most accurate tagline for this film is someone is staring at you and personal growth, because that's like the gist of the whole film, that you have to experience personal growth to actually get to a place where you can have a long-term committed relationship. at least normal people do. Some of us just date the same person at age 20 and still do so 20 years later. Like, what is that like? Tell me about it,
Weird.
friend. I don't
So
know.
weird.
Like, you're supposed to have nothing figured out and have a series of very codependent, dysfunctional relationships, and then wake up one morning and wonder what the hell you're doing at age 33. But that's just it. So yeah, someone is staring at you in personal growth, which I think is also the best bit of like reintroducing him when they're in Shakespeare and Sons.
Yeah.
In
So
New
we're
York.
another 5 years later, I
Yeah.
think.
And that's the first time they actually do start to get along, because when she meets him on the airplane, he's about to get married. And then, as Carrie Fisher predicted, he's no longer married. He's about to get a divorce. And she also has broken up with
Yeah.
Gerald Ford's son. So this is how they bond. And I think there's that moment where they walk in Central Park, and he actually apologizes for his behavior, which another, hey, personal growth, when they were in their 20s. And I think there's that interesting moment after he apologizes where she asks him if they want to go to dinner. And like, it took me a long time, or like it took me several rewatches to pick up on the fact that she's probably asking him out because they're both single and he's suddenly much more attractive because personal growth. And he doesn't pick up on it, or he's not in a place to, which also makes sense because he's about to get a divorce. And just says, "Are we becoming friends now?" And then it's
Yeah.
very, yeah. And I
I
think
th-
that's a crucial moment.
yeah, I think that's a
Yeah.
defining moment of the movie is the point where Billy Crystal's Harry, who was this very superficial, pretending to not be superficial by pretending to be dark character who is not in a healthy relationships, then gets this divorce and doesn't pick up on the fact that now all of a sudden he is interesting to her and she actually might want to start a relationship with him, which is for her a complete 180 from 1977 and 1982. And 1987 Harry does not pick up on that and kind of, in essence, starts the main premise of the movie this way by reinterpreting her asking him out as, oh, do you want to be friends now? And because she doesn't not want to be around him, that's, I think, the thing. Like, she is somehow attracted to him, whether it's as a friend or as a potential romantic partner. She goes with it. That's really, it's, and this is such a small moment. You said it took you a bunch of rewatches. It took me a bunch of rewatches until that really landed for me. And I bet there's people who are going to comment on this and like, that's not what's happening. But I'm pretty sure that's what's happening.
Yeah, I'm
And
pretty
it's such
sure.
a small moment, and you could essentially construct a whole movie around this as the pivotal moment and really, really like highlight it. But they don't do that. It's just this tiny moment. It's gone. Now they're friends, and we see their friendship.
Yeah, and I think that's the, yeah, it's so crucial because again, that the movie isn't about whether or not women and men can be friends. They definitely can. It's just in this case, there probably always was something else going on, and this is why at the end they do get together. I mean, it could have gone another way, and they definitely thought about it going another way, but it also does make sense in the end, and it doesn't come out of nowhere or anything like that. So and I mean, there's also that thing of like, if we're talking personal growth, if they had started to date or tried to date at that moment, they would have not, probably that relationship probably would have failed because they were both just coming out of these long-term relationships they weren't over, because that's all they ever talk about in the preceding like weeks, 2 months, and they're both like depressed. And like when you get to there's a lot of montage that follows that, because we see them like, talking about their breakups and sitting in bed together and like watching Casablanca on a split screen and doing all of that. And you get the immortal line, "That's the good thing about depression, you get your rest." So and and I think that's also like that bit of the film is where it becomes most apparent that a lot of the banter between Harry and Sally is actually the banter that Billy Crystal and Rob Reiner and Annie Scheinman, who is another producer on the film, had like with each other. And it's about Reiner, who was depressed because he had a divorce, and then he had like he was married to Penny Marshall. I need to say this now because I also didn't know he was married to Penny Marshall in the early 80s. And they broke up and they got divorced. And then he was almost apparently not with someone for like almost a decade. So by the time they're making When Harry Met Sally, like he had gone through exactly what Harry had gone through. And Nora Ephron said he was kind of like in love with his depression a little bit. And this is also what they're showing. Like he's very like into it, being depressed, which,
Yeah,
only works if you have a mild depressive episode.
there is there's a couple of lines that apparently got cut from the script, as Nora Ephron writes in her introduction. She writes about Rob Reiner. Rob is a very strange person. He is extremely funny, but he is also extremely depressed, or at least he was at the time. He talked constantly about how depressed he was. Quote, "You know how women have a base of makeup," he said to me. "I have a base of depression. Sometimes I sink below it. Sometimes I rise above it." This line went right into the first draft of the movie, but somewhere along the line, Rob cut it. So this is really actually funny, and I read this introduction years ago, and I've seen the movie. I almost thought that line was in the movie. Like it feels so like it fits into that movie. There's another line where he talks about depression, and it's like playing tennis on a windy day with someone who's worse than you are. They can do all right against you. They can win a couple of games, but there's too much wind. You know what I mean? And then Nora Ephron says she put that in the script too, but she had no idea what that means. I have no idea what that means. But apparently that was a big thing for Rob Reiner. So he put a lot of himself in there, which is also something that Ephron says, that before they had a movie, before they knew what the movie was about, she knew she had a great character in Rob Reiner. So Harry is essentially starts out as a copy paste job of Rob Reiner and what he says and what he thinks about the world.
And I mean and then also the dynamic, like I think a lot of the dynamic then also comes out of Rob Reiner and Nora Ephron having conversations about, again, like sort of the differences between men and women and how they perceive things. And what's interesting, because I mean the most famous scene of the movie is obviously Sally faking the orgasm in Kat's deli, and the way they set that up was that like before that, like we get Sally keeps being shocked at some of like the revelations of like how Harry sees dating and whatever, like that dialogue of them going out on first dates again, and they both have horrible first dates, and she's like, well, it might just take us several months, and like it will take us time to get to a place where we might even like enjoy a date again because of, we're not over our exes, and then it might even take longer to have sex with someone again. But it turns out Harry still had sex with his bad date. That didn't stop him. Like, so all of these like sort of cliches that are grounded in some truth, and then when they get to the fake orgasm thing, that actually came about from like a conversation Nora Ephron and Rob Reiner as well apparently had, and he didn't believe her. He was like, I never heard this. I don't believe that. Like, and then he said, like, he did a sort of very small survey, like, among men who were working on the film of like, do you know about this? And they obviously all said that never happened with them. They can't believe that. But all the women said they've done it. So obviously this is where, that's actually the conversation they end up having in the movie that builds up to her faking that orgasm. And then obviously faking it in front of Rob Reiner's mom. So
which is there's a lot to unpack here. What I like about this scene is that it starts off as this conversation, which Ephron described, and it becomes more when Meg Ryan gets in and says, like, wouldn't it be funnier if she actually faked an orgasm right there in the diner? and then Billy Crystal comes in with the button, "I'll have what she's having," which is then given to Rob Reiner's mom. So this is again, there's a lot to unpack here, but it becomes this iconic scene not because somebody wrote it down and envisioned it that way, but because it was a collaborative process of people actually talking about relationships, and that's what kind of makes it real, because it's a preposterous scene, and it's really a scene that I suppose somebody could have done before this movie comes out, like as a bit in real life. But ever since, you would just be like, "Oh God, no! Why are you when Harry met Sallying me?" Like this is it's just kind of a thing that can never really happen in real life and have that effect, just because it became immediately such a huge trope in popular culture. Like that's the scene that people remember the movie for, even if they haven't seen it.
Yeah, and I think it's remarkable that it comes out of this process. The other more troubling or lot to unpack here thing is that because Meg Ryan didn't like go all out, and I mean it's also like she's sitting among a massive group of extras in Kat's Deli, and obviously you have to do it over and over and over again. But like after 2 or 3 takes, Rob Reiner actually sat down and faked an orgasm in front of his own mother. So I think like it's less
A
the
lot to
problem of
unpack
like
there.
in front of Ira. It's like in front of his mother. And I mean, I don't know if she rated him like an Eastern European, like what is it, East German judge.
East German judge
Must have been the dismount.
Yes.
But yeah, I think that also just speaks to the movie in so many ways. And then there's the other trivia that, like, as I said, like Rob Reiner was depressed. He came out of like, you know, a long streak of like not dating anyone, and after his first wife, and then actually met his still wife. And I mean, this movie is a while ago now, 33 years ago. On set of the film, because she was a friend of Barry Sonnenfeld, and Barry Sonnenfeld, who did a bunch of other things later, mostly cinematographer, did camera on this. So, and he apparently said to Rob, like, no, you're gonna marry this person that I know is my friend. And it brought her over, and I think he says the day they shot and we're gonna come to that scene, but like the day they shot at least the outsides of the in front of Ira scene, and then Harry and Sally go outside to have their fight. When they shot those exteriors is when Barry Sonnenfeld's friend came over and he met his future wife, and it only took them like 8 months after to get married. So all of these like the fact that we have all these real life stories of actual couples in the film that are, shot with actors in the film, but in this documentary style, I think is so much more interesting also because you have that actual that you could have put that story into the film too, and it happened around the film. And I think that also just, kind of lends it to, kind of mythifies that making of the film a little bit as well, because it's so. And they apparently had their first date in the restaurant that then Bruno Kirby, Carrie Fisher, and the 4 of them have their dinner where they want to set up each other with their respective friends, and then it doesn't work.
Right, because now we're in that friends stage, and I think this goes on pretty much. They meet again in 87, and then I think the movie takes us through to what is then present day in 89.
Yeah, sorry. I mean, we do know it's like 12 years between them meeting and then getting together, because at the end they say it only took us 12 years, 6 months, something.
Yeah. So it's pretty much real time for when the movie is released. That happens. So they have their sidekick friends. We have Carrie Fisher as Marie, who is. It's kind of both amazing that it's just this small role, and on the other hand, that she kills it in such an incredible way. That it's just the folding over of the note card "married" is like one of the great performances in comedy, just because it's so subtle and it's just so oh yeah, right, this is the kind of thing I do. And then Bruno Kirby, who is basically kind of starts off as this very stock character, best friend guy who does sports things with Harry, and but the way that they're presented, at the game. I think it's a baseball game where they stand up and keep talking
To
and
the
then do the
wave.
wave but keep talking through the wave, and are in the batting cages and just talk about relationships and talk about their issues, and then Harry and Sally deciding that they really should set up Carrie Fisher's character and Bruno Kirby's character. So Jess and Marie will meet, and it's another great scene because it's so incredibly awkward.
Yeah, like they has just like have zero chemistry. Like trying to set up Marie with Harry, and like the conversations immediately go nowhere. And then they have that amazing, like just Marie have that amazing meet cute where she quotes his own magazine article at him. And which is my ideal meet cute, like someone quoting something I wrote back at me.
It's
um
really for the nerds, right? This is a
yeah, like
nerds thing.
it's just a writer's thing, I think, that you want to happen. And I mean, it's more likely if you're Nora Ephron and end up making all these films that would have happened to you. um it happens less to magazine writers, and it happens even less to academics, I guess. But yeah, it's funny. And then when the two of them like immediately ditch Harry and Sally to go off, and it's like, I mean, good for them, but it's like not what this was supposed to be about. But yeah, where while poor Harry and Sally still aren't over their exes, because another big like plot point is them like running into Harry's ex-wife, and then
Which is where we need to talk about the scene, because this
yeah.
is uh, in essence what inspired us to do this thing. This is what gave us our title for the podcast, which I bet is one of those titles that if you have never seen the movie, you will scratch your head and not understand why on earth anybody would call something that. And if you've seen the movie, you completely understand why this would be such a pivotal moment and why it's a brilliant line as Billy Crystal delivers it. So let's jump to that scene. We have Billy Crystal and Meg Ryan. We have Harry and Sally in their kind of middle of their friendship. They're going to museums. They're having conversations in restaurants, and they're going to Sharper Image. I think it's Sharper Image,
Yeah.
and picking out. I think it's birthday gifts or potential birthday gifts from like among these ridiculous things that you have at Sharper Image, which is if you haven't been to a Sharper Image, is kind of hard to explain, and it's not as relevant as it used to be.
Isn't it a gift for the housewarming, because that's when Jess and Marie live
Yeah,
together?
yeah, yeah, and it's this store of kind of gadgetry, like pointless things that nobody actually needs, but that look really cool. Like they have this helmet with what is it, a fan on it, which then prompts the line, "Why is this necessary in life?" from Sally, which is a line that I think is very useful and that I keep quoting a lot.
In Bavarian it would be braucht das jetzt Arno, which you can leave it or not, but like, yeah. Why is this necessary?
So we're talking about the scene of Harry making a fool of himself and, well, technically Sally making a fool of herself by singing "Sorry with a Fringe on Top" on the karaoke machine in one of the first prominent mentions / uses of a karaoke machine in American films. I assume some film historian can correct me if I'm wrong there, but I certainly haven't seen an earlier one. And in walks his ex-wife, Helen, who that's the breakup that he hasn't quite gotten over. And she basically walks in with her new boyfriend, Ira, who is this very, I don't know, he looks like a more boring version of Harry, like in his like kind of like suit jacket type thing. He doesn't look like the person that somebody who did not want to be with Billy Crystal would flock to. Like they are too similar for that. and he's completely flustered and he's completely embarrassed by doing stupid bits with Sally singing karaoke in front of Ira, which is what he then references later.
Yeah, and I mean, there's also the fact that they go back, like that they got Oklahoma in there somehow, and I think that's also interesting because, like, I mean, we can talk about this now. We can talk about it later, but I think there's so many ways that this film has been referenced, like in the future, in the same genre and in other genres, but also within the romantic comedy and even I think now there's a reference to Oklahoma, it sometimes is a reference to When Harry Met Sally because of that bit, and I think that's interesting too. And I mean, it's that I think it's also an important moment for them because he has that outburst when they go back to Jess and Marie's, who are just moving in together and have their own like conflicts about the wagon wheel coffee table, and all of that. But I think it's also important
Brings it
because they
all out.
have an actual fight. Like Harry and Sally have an actual sort of nasty fight, but it actually ends immediately with him then also apologizing to her, which is again like the whole personal
Personal growth,
growth.
yeah.
Yeah. Like we have two moments where he apologizes to her for his behavior. Um and yeah, and that's I think that's still something we don't really see enough on screen overall. Like people make fools of themselves, and especially like I mean if you talk about like act structure, I think that's the thing that does make it also like that's more usual for romantic comedies with this film is also I think it has that sort of three act structure of them, despite having all these time jumps. It's
Hmm.
that the middle is obviously them actually being friends, and then the third is that moment when they obviously after they have sex and then don't speak to each other and run after them. And that moment is always there. There's always like I can't think of a rom-com where there isn't a moment where the main couple for whatever reason doesn't speak to each other for a while. Like that has to happen somehow. Like it always has to be in there, whether and I think there are these moments of conflict, but it's hard to say there isn't always an apology attached to it. Like there isn't always accountability for kind of bad behavior in so many ways. And I think that's actually what the film does well.
Yeah,
But yeah,
there's really not a lot of media that does that. So
yeah,
so I think I completely agree. This is a very classically structured movie. You have this
yeah,
first act of kicking things off, which really kind of takes all the shortcuts by reintroducing us to our characters in different ways, which is kind of a great way of getting a lot of character traits out there and making people understand what this is about. Then the whole middle part of them being friends, which is essentially that it builds, it develops, it has all the kind of momentum of a second act. And I think it doesn't drag, which often happens in these romantic comedies because it's so distinguished from the first act. And then after they sleep together, which again, spoiler alert, it is that classic all is lost moment, which we have again and again and again, but it works, and it works here. There's one more thing that I wanted to reference with regards to that in front of Ira scene, because it's not just the referencing Oklahoma or sorry with a fringe on top. It's also the idea of the karaoke scene, or like a semblance of the karaoke scene is a reference for this is a romantic relationship. This is something that we're specifically calling back to. And I'm thinking especially here of a scene in the American version of The Office, which is in
mm,
like a later season, where you have Jim and Pam go off into a store to buy things. And then you have Jenna Fisher's Pam grabbing the microphone and making fun with the microphone. And she essentially says that this is a complete ripoff of or homage to When Harry Met Sally, which is also a film that she, as a comedic actress says she's seen like multiple times or listened to on
Yeah.
tapes and things like that. So people reference this movie because it is such a classic reinvention of the romantic comedy. It doesn't invent the romantic comedy. We can talk about when that was invented and traditions and genre and all of that. It's not the first romantic comedy movie, but it does kind of start off a certain wave of, at the same time, commercialized but also kind of quiet romantic comedies, very much almost French movie, as they reference in the introduction. There's a cut line that Nora Ephron has about how when Harry and Sally talk about being characters in a movie and asking what would this movie be about, we'd just be talking. And then Harry says in French movies, they just talk.
Yeah, and again, yeah, I mean, obviously the screwball comedy does all of that, but I do think it does kick off the modern romantic comedy, and this is why it's referenced over and over again. And I think, like, almost every film we're gonna discuss in this will have some kind of reference to it. Sometimes it's smaller, and and there's movies who completely go to it. But since you just mentioned The Office, and predictably I have to do this, but it fits like Ted Lasso, and I
Oh,
mean,
that fits perfectly. Yeah.
like I mean, like that's one of the things that has reference When Harry Met Sally over and over again, and not just in season 2 in Rainbow when they do the whole rom-communism thing, where they do the documentary style couples and do all of this and also make much more word references to several romantic comedies, but they also do it over and over. Like, I mean, as we're sitting here, the show ends in 2 weeks, so we don't know about like Ted and Rebecca, but like people have, like all the people who are thinking that this is where that show will go have that When Harry Met Sally thing running through their head the whole time.
Yeah.
But like that's one of the shows that references that over and over again as well. And I think that's just like, it has influenced so many rom-coms up until right now as we're sitting here, like over
Yeah.
30 years later.
Yeah, it keeps coming up. It's kind of like a thing you need to either reference directly or indirectly. And Ted Lasso actually also one of the few pieces of media that does exactly what When Harry Met Sally does. It features characters who screw up and grow by apologizing for it. They write on, like, this is the whole storyline of Rebecca in season 1 in Ted Lasso,
Yeah, and
completely
then
screwing up
everyone
and apologizing, and it's okay. Like the fact that it's actually okay to admit that you've been wrong and you've done bad things, and that you can grow from that. Obviously, it depends on how bad they are. But
I think by the time this will go online, people will have seen it, so I can spoil this week's episode. But that's also just about people apologizing to each other. Roy apologizing to Keeley. Like it's always there. It's always about accountability. And like you can screw up. You just need to be accountable for it later, and you need to do this. And so much of that show is also just people having conversations and also people meeting. So for the longest time, they didn't have a title for When Harry Met Sally. They even held a contest to figure out, like, within the studio.
I have a bunch of the titles here that they've tried out.
Please say the titles.
So we have Blue Moon is one that they tried for a minute, which is interesting because like it's kind of close to Moonstruck. We had Just Friends, Play Melancholy Baby, which I think is among the worst. I don't understand what that means. Boy Meets Girl, which kind of puts you in the mood that these people are much younger.
Yeah.
Words of Love, which makes it seem like it's a 1970s movie about a romance that ends tragically. It Had to Be You, which I think that would be my runner-up title. That's the one that I would choose, just because that song is so prominent.
Might have been another copyright issue at that point. Yeah.
And Harry, This Is Sally, as well as How They Met. So they kind of like circling around this whole like meeting, them two meeting, and what grows from that. So those are, except for I guess Blue Moon
and this
Words
is
of
also
Love.
Why they settle on the meeting, because they said it's really all about the meeting. Which, I mean, again, the rom-com has that important thing of the meet cute, that and again, that's not a traditional one for them at all, but it's still, and I think for them, and that's the interesting thing, they don't just have that one meet cute because they don't actually like each other, but they meet again and again, and whenever they meet, something changes. Their relationship changes in some way every time they meet. I mean, even when the second time they meet, they still don't like each other, but I think she still gets a different point of view on him because that's when he's about to get married, and she didn't expect that from him at all. And again, it's the personal growth thing. Like, she can see the growth happening, and probably vice versa. But I think since it's so much more about the neurosis of the male, here in the Woody Allen tradition, I guess. And sorry to
Which
have
is
to invoke
another
him,
thing, yeah, we need to
but
talk about when it
like,
comes to romantic comedies.
and I mean, there's also like maybe like also looking at time, like a nice segue into reviews, because some of the reviews of this film, like, I mean, I read some of like just basic reviews you can still find from the actual like release from '89. So there's still some like basic headlines or basic like reviews, and the bad reviews basically all call this like a ripoff of Woody Allen, like in a negative way. It's a, oh, the sitcom version of a Woody Allen film was the New York Times review, for instance, and they only give it 50 out of 100. I think it's the worst review.
I mean, it definitely it slots itself into that tradition with the white titles on black and the kind of American songbook music. It very much references a lot of the same tropes. Yeah.
And again, obviously Jewish tradition, etc., and so on. But I think that it's still crucial that like a woman does write it, and I do think that changes a lot how also Sally works as a 3-dimensional female character, and how you also have Marie, who's very different from her. And I think that's the, and it's still, I mean, if you look at some of the rom-coms from the early 2000s, a lot of the women are in very 3-dimensional, even if we spend a lot of time with them. It's so obviously, a lot of the times, it's still women written by men.
It's, you get career girl TM, you get basically the what is the character in Elizabethtown, that the reviewer coined that term, the manic pixie dream girl.
I was going to say manic pixie dream girl, yeah.
Based on that, and you get kind of, I guess kind of those are the two really big tropes that you see, and you don't really see that much variety from that. You sometimes have.
It is Manic Pixie Dream from, isn't it from like also like Zach Braff? Like isn't Natalie Portman in Garden State the OG Manic?
Yeah, but like I mean, potentially we can also talk about the Zoe Deschanel extended universe. But the term was coined by a reviewer who reviewed Elizabethtown, the movie, and basically saying that this is that character, which I mean it is of that age of movies. So this is the early 2000s.
I haven't seen it in a long time, but I was one of the 5 people who actually liked Elizabethtown.
We're gonna have to do that one.
Yeah. Anyway, I mean, maybe I won't like it now. I liked it back then. And yeah, as in for like other reviews, like the more positive reviews, Roger Ebert, for instance, to like praise the chemistry between the leads, and I think that's also the thing that also keeps selling the film. Like, I mean, obviously the dialogue and all of that, but the dialogue also only works if the chemistry between the actors works, and I think that's crucial. And I think the best review actually comes from the LA Times. The summer's uncorseted, qualified delight. Someone else for like Global and Mail compared it to a raspberry sorbet. So apparently it was a summer film, which is interesting because if I think about the film, and if you also look at the poster for the film, it's fall in New York, and that's what I will always connect it to. Like, especially also with, I think, the jazzy, like the jazz standards that are the soundtrack, and like Harry Connick Jr. doing that, and then some Louis Armstrong in there, and some.
And I mean, like, if we just kind of like, this is the image that they're using for the poster. These people are not dressed for summer.
Yeah, like, and even the one you have looks different from some of the posters that actually have them with fall foliage in Central Park. So I have one on my wall that's fall foliage, which I can show you because it's in my hallway. But So the version of that where you don't see the skyline, you actually see Central Park around them. But that's the thing, right? And I mean, we haven't really talked about the fact that it's set in New York, but I think that also
which
sets a
is
precedent
kind of
here.
important. I mean,
Yeah,
we're
I
working
mean, we talk
ourselves
about all
to.
the locations, but
Yeah, there's always these. I don't know how many TV critics thought that they were smart by saying that the Starship Enterprise is the main character in Star Trek, and in the same sense, New York is kind of the main character in When Harry Met Sally, because
yeah,
they literally drive to New York. That is part of the setup of this movie, and New York is almost to them this other place. Like, again, this is such a typical movie trope, kind of almost like a yeah, very very clear, um, almost Wizard of Oz like thing where you go to this other place in which then things will happen to you, and that's definitely New York because
yeah.
they don't start there.
Yeah, and that's where all the personal growth happens. You have to go there. I mean, they don't leave it at the end, so that's not Dorothy and Oz. Which also would be another Ted Lasso thing. He literally comes from Kansas to go to London and then will probably leave again. But with New York, I think I mean New York definitely is another it's the other character in the film. Even though I think that's the important part is that except for Katz's delicatessen, almost all the other locations they use are the Upper West Side, and then obviously like sort of the part of Central Park there, which matters obviously in terms of like Jewish New York, but also the fact that they're all white and
Mm.
upwardly mobile, as he used to say, like they're upper middle class. They all of the jobs they have, even though they never talk about them, which is another thing Rob Reiner said, because people are like, oh, you have all these like successful characters, and I think that's also that late '80s mindset of like, why do we never see them at work? Why do they never talk about work? And it's like, yeah, they do that, but that's when we have the camera off, and I think that's interesting because it's like, of course, that matters to their lives. We do get the bit that just as a journalist, which is why Marie can quote back, like, he's a writer, so and then we know Harry's a political consultant, etc., but it's not like
Probably
a
for Gerald L.
central.
Ford.
Yes. So you have that, like, it's a typical Nora Ephron. Like if you read any Nora Ephron and about her own life, like Heartburn, that's just her world as well. I think
Mm.
that's mostly her world. Maybe not as much as Rob Reiner, who's obviously a movie director. Like, but she's very much in that world of like political consultants and writers and
Yeah.
journalists.
Yeah, I mean, it is in the end pretty much the epitome of write what you know in
Yeah.
terms of relationships, in terms of the world that you occupy and that the people you know occupy. It's kind of the same criticism that was lobbed at Friends in its later seasons. Why do these people not know any working class characters? Why did they not know any black people? Well, this is not who you would know in that world. That doesn't seem to be a world in which
Yeah, I like.
people would be important in your life, which
I,
is obviously a very specific slice of humanity there.
Yeah, and actually, one of the other negative reviews mentions the all-white New York of Woody Allen as well. And I mean, it
Yeah.
does make a certain sense in that these people wouldn't have black friends. It would always feel like if you're looking at, I don't think Nora Ephron probably had a lot of black friends. Like that doesn't make this better because movies are also supposed to be, there's obviously so many discussions that are valid about diversity and representations. But if you're really honest about the circles they were in, they wouldn't have had any, and that's sad. But like, and then obviously, yeah, it's a very very specific part of like
Yeah.
a New
I mean, there's
York,
also
and
what is probably more down to what you could put in a romantic comedy at the time,
yeah,
but there's no queer people in this, like,
yeah,
at all, which does strike. I mean, rewatching it does strike you. I mean, it is the
yeah,
most
especially if you go,
1940s kind of. I mean, part of that is the nostalgia of like the 1940s, like when you had like or even the code era films where there was certain things you could show and certain things you could not show, and it just completely embraces this. Like that's the references to Casablanca are there's a certain kind of 1940s glam Hollywood romance that they're embracing, which is very white, which is very cis, which is very hetero, and the most normative that you can imagine.
Yeah, and that's it. And I mean, again, it has to do with what Hollywood lets you do at the time, which also reflects back on what's actually happening at the time, also with queer people, and specifically queer people of color, which is the AIDS crisis. And like, I mean, it goes from the late 70s into the late 80s. This is the time when New York is at its worst. Like, that's the other thing too. Like, I mean, New York goes through a massive economic downfall. There's like literal, like, you know, and if you look at the Bronx at that specific time, like, this is like with good reason the birth of hip hop. That's like the aftermath of like the Robert Moses stuff, and the HIV/AIDS crisis. And we get none of that. And I mean, of course we don't, but it's also like, again, this is where you have that very, very specific, almost like fantasy fairy tale life. Although I'm pretty sure people like Nora Ephron, sort of to a certain degree, would have lived in that bubble. Although, to her credit, she actually at the time was someone who would like knew Larry Kramer, and went to places actually. And she as far as I know, she was an advocate for like gay rights and stuff. But that's, again, like, you have so many like axes of like, what kind of world do you want to portray, what can you portray in Hollywood at the time, etc. And I think if you look like 10 years later, you've got male, at least, like Tom Hanks's friend is black because it's Dave Chappelle, which is a whole other. Is it Dave Chappelle? I think.
Yeah, I think so.
But like, yeah. So I mean, like, this is not in any way like justifying why New York is that white, but I think it's still very telling of like which specific part of New York.
It's a very specific movie, and it's not. I think the criticism you can really lob at this movie is it is not in any way ambitious about being anything else than what the people who are sitting at the table coming up with this can think of, like the world in which they live.
Yeah.
It doesn't try in any way to go outside of that and be anything else at all.
Yeah, and I don't think it's not progressive. Like I mean, it's not unfeminist or anything, but in any other way, it's not progressive. Like, it still deals a lot with all these stereotypes that do exist for a reason. But like, it's not
the whole men and women, can they be friends? Men are, like this, women are like this. It's the kind of thing that grates if you listen to it on drive time radio now. Like, that seems to be a thing. Like, every morning on the radio, there's a man and a woman talking, and they're saying like, "Oh yeah, you men like this, and we women like that," and it feels like that is such a weirdly preserved part of media that existed very much at that point in time. It doesn't allow for anything outside of that. That said, it is, for coloring inside the lines that it has, it does all of that perfectly. Like, what it sets out to do, I think this is, it does perfectly. It does pretty much flawlessly. It sets out to tell this story with internal, not external conflict. It has the perfect casting for all of that. It has very smart dialogue. It has very on-point direction. It's not trying to be flashy. It's not trying to be something that it's not. But again, it's not ambitious to exceed what it is at all.
Yeah, so is it a romantic comedy?
Yeah, let's get to our kind of final questions. You're asking it, so I guess I'm the one answering this at first. So it is, to me, this is a romantic comedy, and not just because we've been calling this a romantic comedy and we're calling our romantic comedy podcast In Front of Ira based on this romantic comedy. To me, what in essence makes a romantic comedy is that the romantic plot is what everything revolves around. And there can be other things that occur, there can be other things that happen, but if you subtract them, you would still be left with a romantic plot that works by itself, which this one definitely has. It doesn't need the external conflict. It doesn't have any aliens. It doesn't have any ticking clocks. It doesn't have anything but this romantic plot to fall back on. And it is also a movie that tries to be funny, which is I think my judgment in terms of what a romantic comedy is. It doesn't have to be funny. You don't have to actually laugh at a romantic comedy because maybe the humor is subtle, maybe the humor is not meant for you, or maybe it's just not funny to you because other people have different ideas of what is funny. But it tries to be funny, and it sometimes genuinely succeeds. This scene with "I'll roll down the window." We talked about this again a few days ago, and you rewatched it, and I just read it in the script, and I started laughing. If you know this scene, it is funny. So those are things. To me, those are the two most important things. It has to be about the romantic plot, and it has to try to be funny. And this one also adds this idea of the passage of time. That you get to know these people. You have time to get to know these people, which is why it works. Which is also why I think that sometimes television shows can be among the best romantic comedies. I mean, Cheers is kind of a classic example here, Moonlighting, because you get to know these characters.
Yeah.
But that's not necessarily maybe essential for it. But to me, those two things definitely are. So this is a romantic comedy, yes.
Yeah, and I obviously agree. It's the romantic comedy, or at least the modern romantic comedy, which we mentioned before. And I think, like, if I'd have to pinpoint why, it's definitely also the dialogue, because it is funny, and it's so, that seems to be a key thing, at least for me. Like, this is what usually makes me like or stick with a movie, is often the dialogue, just being very on point. The obviously chemistry between the leads, like the dialogue, like those two always go together. The dialogue, like it's always like the acting is only so good as the writing, but I think there's certain vice versa. If you don't do good line readings, they will also fall flat. That's what it is. Then there also, in this case, there is a certain amount of improv from Billy Crystal. There's like a lot of input from the actors, so it is the collaborative process. It has that like classic 3-act structure. And probably helps cement it again also for future films. It's set in New York. I mean, we'll have other ones that aren't, but that like romance only happens in New York ever. And then I think, yeah, also just the whole package of like the music, for instance. And, they picked all these classical jazz standards, like It Had to Be You. And so, yeah, it is the in many ways a definitive romantic comedy, and why it's referenced over and over again. And I give it 5 out of 5 wagon wheel coffee tables.
Yes, 5 out of 5 karaoke in front of Ira microphones. It's, again, we have criticized this. We know that it's not something that it's not, but for what it tries to be, it does that perfectly. And I think the fact that it's so lodged in the romantic comedy subconscious means that you can kind of build on it. You reinterpret it. It's a good text to have as a basis for romantic comedies going forward.
Yeah, and that's what we're intending to do. Thanks for listening. Download, subscribe, and rate us, and highly, obviously.
We're on social media at In Front of Ira, and you can follow along as we discuss more romantic comedies in front of all of you.
And especially in front of Ira.